The village of Lidice lay 17 kilometers northwest of Prague, a collection of modest homes and farm buildings scattered across the Bohemian countryside where families had lived for generations. In the spring of 1942, approximately 500 people called this place home. They were miners, farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers whose lives followed the rhythms of work and family that had defined Czech village existence for centuries. The men descended into the Kladno coal mines each morning, returning with blackened hands and tired bodies. The women tended gardens, raised children, and maintained households. The children attended school in the village centre, played in the fields, and knew every path and hiding place in the landscape of their childhood. The village had a church, a school, small shops, and a sense of community built through shared meals, celebrations, and the ordinary accumulation of years spent among neighbours who knew each other's stories. The German occupation of Czechoslovakia had begun in March 1939, transforming daily life through restrictions, curfews, and the constant presence of an authority that answered to Berlin rather than Prague. The Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, as the Germans renamed the occupied territory, existed under the control of officials who viewed the Czech population as labour resources to be exploited and potential resistors to be suppressed. Reinhard Heydrich arrived in Prague in September 1941 as acting Reich Protector, bringing with him a reputation for ruthless efficiency. He had been one of the primary architects of the final solution and had earned the nickname the Butcher of Prague through his policies of mass arrests, executions, and the systematic dismantling of Czech resistance networks. Under his administration, thousands were imprisoned or killed, and the population learned to move through daily life with careful attention to avoiding attention from authorities who could destroy families with a signature on a detention order. On May 27, 1942, Czech resistance fighters trained in Britain and sent back to occupied territory carried out an assassination attempt against Heydrich as his car travelled through Prague. The attack succeeded in wounding him severely, and after days of infection and medical complications, Heydrich died on June 4. The assassination represented one of the most significant acts of resistance against Nazi occupation in Europe, but it triggered a response of extraordinary brutality. Adolf Hitler and other Nazi leaders decided that the assassination required massive retaliation to crush Czech resistance and demonstrate the consequences of attacking German authority. The reprisals that followed would be calculated not for military or strategic value but for their capacity to inspire terror through the destruction of communities and the elimination of populations deemed collectively guilty. In the days following Heydrich's death, German security services interrogated suspects, searched villages, and compiled lists of places and people connected, however tenuously, to resistance activities. The village of Lidice appeared on these lists because of information, later discovered to be false, suggesting that some villages had sheltered resistance members or knew about the assassination plot. The evidence was circumstantial and contradictory, but the Nazi command structure was not concerned with judicial standards or the verification of accusations. They needed targets for retaliation, and Lidice, an ordinary village with no military significance, would serve that purpose. The decision to destroy Lidice completely was made by Karl Hermann Frank, the senior SS officer in Prague, with Hitler's explicit approval. The operation would not be a conventional military action but a systematic annihilation designed to erase the village from existence as a demonstration of German power. On the evening of June 9, 1942, German security police and SS units surrounded Lidice. The soldiers arrived quietly, taking up positions around the village perimeter to prevent anyone from escaping. The residents had no warning of what was coming. Families were eating evening meals, children were being prepared for bed, and the routines of ordinary life continued in the moments before the Germans entered the village. When the soldiers began moving through the streets, knocking on doors and ordering families outside, the villagers initially believed this was another search operation or a roundup for questioning. Such actions had become part of occupied life, frightening but survivable if one cooperated and had nothing to hide. The residents of Lidice had no reason to believe this night would be different from previous encounters with German authority. The men and boys over the age of 15 were separated from the women and children immediately. The Germans ordered them into groups and marched them to various buildings in the village centre. The women and children were taken to the school building and held under guard. The separation created immediate anxiety among the villagers, as families were divided without explanation and the soldiers provided no information about what would happen next. Mothers clutched their younger children, trying to calm them as they watched fathers and older sons being led away. The men looked back at their families, some calling out reassurances, others silent with the understanding that something beyond the usual harassment was unfolding. Throughout the night of June 9 and into the early morning of June 10, The men of Lidice were taken in groups of 10 to the garden of the Horak family farm. The garden was surrounded by a wall that would contain what was about to occur. The men were positioned against the wall, and German soldiers shot them with automatic weapons. The executions continued in groups throughout the night. One set of 10 men killed, their bodies dragged aside, and the next group brought forward. Some men remained calm, facing their deaths with the dignity of people who understood there was no escape. Others broke down, weeping or praying. A few attempted to speak final words before the shots silenced them. The sound of gunfire echoed across the village in irregular bursts that continued for hours, each volley marking the end of 10 more lives. The women and children in the school building could hear the shots, understanding with growing horror what the sounds meant. Some women screamed or fainted. Others held their children close, trying to shield them from understanding what was happening to their fathers and brothers. By dawn on June 10th, 173 men and boys from Lidice had been executed. The bodies lay in piles in the garden, awaiting disposal. The Germans photographed the scene, documenting their work with the bureaucratic thoroughness that characterized Nazi operations. The photographs, later entered into evidence at war crimes trials, showed the wall, the bodies, and the German soldiers standing nearby with expressions ranging from satisfaction to indifference. The garden where children had once played had been transformed into an execution ground, the soil soaked with blood that would remain visible for days. The women and children were held in the school while the executions continued. They received no food or water, and the sanitary conditions deteriorated rapidly as more than 200 people were confined in spaces designed for classroom instruction. Young children cried from hunger and fear. Older children tried to comfort younger siblings. The mothers attempted to maintain some semblance of order and hope, though many were in states of shock from the night's events. On the morning of June 10th, the Germans separated the children from their mothers. The soldiers went through the group, pulling children away from women who fought desperately to hold on to them. The separation was brutal and chaotic, with mothers screaming and children reaching back toward parents they would never see again. The soldiers used force to break the physical connections between mothers and children, dragging crying children away while other soldiers restrained the mothers. 7 children from Lidice were later deemed suitable for Germanization, a Nazi program that took children considered racially valuable and placed them with German families to be raised as Germans. These 7 children, selected based on physical appearance and age, were sent to Germany and given new names and identities. The remaining children, 82 in total, were transported to the Chelmno extermination camp in occupied Poland. At Chelmno, the children were murdered in gas vans, vehicles designed to kill occupants through carbon monoxide poisoning during transport. The children of Lidice died without understanding why they had been taken from their mothers or what crime they had committed to deserve such a fate. They died frightened and alone, calling for parents who could not hear them. The women of Lidice were transported to Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany. They traveled in overcrowded cattle cars without adequate food, water, or sanitation facilities. The journey took days, during which several women died from the conditions or from the psychological trauma of having watched their husbands and sons executed and their children torn from their arms. At Ravensbrück, the women from Lidice were processed like all concentration camp prisoners, stripped, shaved, tattooed with identification numbers, and assigned to forced labor details. They worked in factory operations, experienced starvation conditions, and lived under the constant threat of selection for the gas chamber or medical experiments. Some women from Lidice survived the war and were liberated in 1945. Others died in the camp from disease, malnutrition, or murder. Those who survived carried with them the knowledge that their entire families had been destroyed and their village erased. While the men were being executed and the women and children transported away, German forces began the systematic destruction of Lidice itself. Soldiers went through every building in the village, removing anything of value or use. Furniture, tools, livestock, and personal possessions were loaded onto trucks and transported away. Once the buildings were emptied, demolition teams set them on fire. The church, the school, the homes, the shops, and every other structure were burned. The fires were visible for miles, columns of smoke rising into the sky throughout June 10th and 11th. After the fires burned out, German engineers used explosives to destroy the remaining walls and foundations. They wanted no structure left standing, no evidence that buildings had ever existed in this place. The cemetery where generations of Lidice's dead had been buried was destroyed. The Germans dug up the graves, removed the bodies, and burned them. The headstones were smashed or removed. The careful records that families had maintained of their ancestors were eliminated. Even the dead were not permitted to remain at rest in Lidice. The Germans then brought in heavy equipment to alter the landscape itself. They filled in the village pond, diverted the stream that had run through the community, and used explosives and machinery to change the contours of the land. Trees were cut down, roads were ploughed under, and the entire area was leveled and planted with crops. The objective was to erase Lidice so completely that no physical trace would indicate a village had ever existed here. The Nazis announced the destruction of Lidice publicly, using it as propaganda to demonstrate the consequences of resistance. German newspapers and radio broadcasts described Lidice as a nest of assassins and traitors that had been righteously eliminated. The message was clear: any community that harbored or supported resistance would face total annihilation. The announcement created shock and horror throughout occupied Europe and in Allied nations. The complete destruction of a civilian village, the execution of all adult males, and the deportation of women and children to concentration camps represented a level of collective punishment that exceeded even the brutal standards of Nazi occupation policy. The name Lidice became synonymous with Nazi atrocity, and the village entered international consciousness as a symbol of civilians suffering under totalitarian occupation. Communities around the world responded to the destruction of Lidice by naming places after the destroyed village. Towns in Latin America, North America, and elsewhere adopted the name Lidice in solidarity with the Czech people and in memorial to the destroyed community. In Illinois, a town changed its name from Stern Park to Lidice. In Mexico, a plaza was renamed Plaza Lidice. These gestures of remembrance helped ensure that even though the physical village had been erased, the name and memory of Lidice would survive. The international response also placed pressure on Nazi Germany and created propaganda challenges for a regime attempting to justify its actions as legitimate responses to terrorism. In Czechoslovakia, the destruction of Lidice created deep trauma within the national consciousness. The village had been entirely ordinary, with no particular significance beyond being home to its residents. The fact that such a place could be completely eliminated demonstrated that no one was safe and that German occupation would punish not only individuals but entire communities for perceived offences. The fear this created served the Nazi purpose of suppressing resistance, but it also generated bitter resentment that would persist long after the war ended. Czechs who learned of Lidice's fate understood that their own villages and families could suffer the same destruction, and this knowledge shaped behaviour and attitudes throughout the remainder of the occupation. The site where Lidice had stood remained empty for the duration of the war. Crops grew in the fields that covered the village, and gradually nature began reclaiming the land. The stream that had been diverted found new channels. Grass covered the scars where buildings had been demolished. To a casual observer passing through the area in 1943 or 1944, nothing would suggest that hundreds of people had lived here, that children had played in these fields, or that families had built lives across generations in this place. The erasure appeared complete, exactly as the Germans had intended. When the war ended in May 1945 and Czechoslovakia was liberated, survivors and refugees began returning to their home regions. The women from Lidice who had survived Ravensbrück came back to Bohemia seeking news of their children and hoping against all evidence that some family members might have survived. They learned the full scope of what had been done to their community, the execution of all men and boys, the murder of nearly all the children, and the complete destruction of the village. The psychological burden of this knowledge was almost unbearable. The women had lost not only individual family members but their entire world. The homes they had lived in, the streets they had walked, the church where they had worshipped, and the cemetery where their ancestors rested had all been obliterated. In the immediate post-war period, discussions began about whether and how to rebuild Lidice. Some argued that the site should remain empty as a memorial to what had occurred there, a permanent reminder of Nazi crimes. Others believed that rebuilding the village would represent resistance to the Nazi attempt at erasure and would honor the memory of those who had been killed by recreating the community they had built. The Czechoslovak government, with significant international support, decided to rebuild Lidice adjacent to the original site. The new village would be a living community where families would establish homes and continue the patterns of life that had been interrupted by the massacre. The construction of the new Lidice began in the late 1940s. Architects designed a modern village that would provide housing, schools, and community facilities while incorporating memorial elements that acknowledge the history of the site. The original location where the old village had stood was preserved as a memorial park and museum. Archaeological excavations located the foundations of buildings, the execution wall, and the cemetery, marking these places so that visitors could understand the physical layout of the destroyed community. A memorial garden was created with roses representing each person killed in the massacre, and a museum was built to house photographs, documents, and artifacts related to Lidicé's history before and during the destruction. Survivors of Lidicé, primarily the women who had been sent to Ravensbrück, were offered homes in the new village. Some accepted and spent their remaining years living near the site where they had lost everything. Others found the proximity to such traumatic memories unbearable and chose to rebuild their lives elsewhere. The women who did return to Lidicé became living witnesses to the massacre, sharing their testimonies with journalists, historians, and visitors who came to the memorial. Their accounts provided personal detail and emotional depth to the historical record, transforming the abstract statistics of 173 men killed and 82 children murdered into stories of specific individuals with names, personalities, and relationships. The 7 children from Lidicé who had been selected for Germanization and sent to Germany presented a particularly painful chapter in the post-war story. These children had been very young when taken from their mothers, and they had spent formative years being raised as Germans with new identities. After the war, efforts were made to locate these children and return them to Czechoslovakia. Some were found and reunited with surviving relatives, though the reunions were complicated by the fact that the children had no memory of their original families and had been thoroughly acculturated into German identity. They faced the challenge of learning a new language, adapting to a different culture, and processing the knowledge that they had been stolen from their families. The psychological damage to these children was profound and lifelong. The trials of those responsible for the Lidicé massacre occurred in the broader context of post-war justice for Nazi crimes. Karl Hermann Frank, who had ordered the destruction of Lidicé, was captured by American forces in 1945 and extradited to Czechoslovakia to face trial. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, with the Lidicé massacre forming a central part of the charges against him. Frank was executed by hanging in Prague in 1946, with the execution carried out publicly before a large crowd that included survivors of Nazi persecution. The execution was filmed and photographed, creating a visual record of accountability for the crimes committed against Lidicé and other Czech communities. Other perpetrators who had participated directly in the executions or the destruction of the village were also prosecuted, though many escaped justice. Some German soldiers and police who had been present at Lidicé were killed during the war or disappeared in its chaotic conclusion. Others were not identified or successfully evaded prosecution by hiding their wartime activities. The trials that did occur established the historical record and provided some measure of justice, but they could not undo what had been done or return to survivors what they had lost. The memorial at Lidicé developed over decades into a significant site of Holocaust and World War II remembrance. The museum expanded its collections, gathering photographs from before the massacre that showed village life, portraits of residents, and scenes of ordinary community existence. These images provided visual documentation of what had been destroyed, showing the faces of the men who were executed, the children who were murdered, and the women who survived but lost their families. The photographs transformed the victims from anonymous statistics into visible individuals whose humanity was evident in their expressions and poses. The memorial also collected testimonies from survivors, recording their accounts on film and audio for preservation. These testimonies described life in Lidicé before the occupation, the night of the massacre, the separation of families, and the years of imprisonment in concentration camps. The survivors spoke about specific people: fathers who had been kind and hardworking, children who had been bright and playful, neighbors who had been generous and supportive. They described the physical details of the village, the layout of streets, the appearance of homes, the sound of the church bells. Through these testimonies, the destroyed village gained texture and specificity that prevented its reduction to mere symbol or abstraction. Educational programs at the Lidicé Memorial brought school groups and international visitors to learn about the massacre and its historical context. The programs addressed not only the events of June 1942 but also broader questions about totalitarianism, collective punishment, resistance, and the nature of Nazi occupation. Educators used Lidicé as a case study for examining how ordinary communities became targets in ideological warfare, and how civilian populations experienced the brutality of regimes that recognized no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. The programs emphasized that the victims of Lidicé had been neither soldiers nor partisans but ordinary people whose only offense was living in a place that Nazi authorities decided to use as an example. The international connections that had begun with cities renaming themselves after Lidicé continued and expanded after the war. Communities that had adopted the name Lidicé in 1942 maintained relationships with the rebuilt Czech village, exchanging delegations, supporting the memorial, and participating in commemoration ceremonies. These connections created a global network of remembrance that ensured Lidicí's story reached audiences far beyond Czechoslovakia. The international dimension also provided support for survivors and later for the memorial site itself, with donations funding museum expansions, educational programs, and preservation efforts. The memorial landscape at Lidice includes not only museum buildings and mark foundations but also artistic responses to the massacre. Sculptures and monuments created by Czech and international artists provide different interpretive approaches to memorializing mass atrocity. One significant work is a bronze sculpture of children, representing those who were murdered, their figures captured in poses suggesting play and innocence. The sculpture serves as a visual reminder of what was lost and provides a focal point for mourning and reflection. The rose garden, with each bush representing an individual victim, creates a living memorial that changes with seasons, blooming in summer and becoming dormant in winter in a cycle that contrasts with the finality of the deaths being commemorated. The story of Lidice continued to resonate through the decades following the war, maintaining relevance as new generations encountered the history. During the communist period in Czechoslovakia, Lidice became part of the narrative of anti-fascist resistance, with emphasis placed on the village's victimization by German fascism and less attention to the complexities of the Nazi racial ideology that had motivated the massacre. After the fall of communism in 1989 and the establishment of democratic government, the memorial was able to present a more nuanced historical interpretation that addressed all aspects of Nazi occupation and its impact on Czech society. The women who survived Lidice and Ravensbrück aged and died over the decades following the war, taking with them direct personal memory of the events. The last survivors passed away in the early 21st century, marking a transition in how Lidice's story would be transmitted to future generations. Without living witnesses, the memorial site, the preserved testimonies, and the historical documentation became the primary means through which knowledge of the massacre would be maintained. This transition created urgency around preservation efforts and educational programs, as institutions recognized the responsibility of maintaining memory when direct witness was no longer possible. Contemporary remembrance of Lidice addresses the massacre within multiple contexts. It is understood as part of the broader Nazi campaign of terror against occupied populations, connecting it to similar atrocities committed in other villages across Eastern Europe. It is also examined as an example of collective punishment, a war crime that violated international law even by the standards of 1942. The massacre is studied in relation to the Holocaust, as the murder of the Jewish children from Lidice at Chelmno represents the intersection of anti-resistance reprisal and genocidal policy. Scholars analyze Lidice alongside other Nazi annihilation actions to understand patterns in how the regime selected targets, executed mass killings, and used terror as a weapon of occupation. The rebuilt village of Lidice exists today as both a living community and a memorial landscape. Families live in homes built on land adjacent to where the original village stood. Children attend schools, adults work in nearby cities or local businesses, and daily life continues with the patterns characteristic of Czech village existence. The presence of the memorial site creates a unique situation where contemporary life occurs in close proximity to preserved spaces of mass death and destruction. Residents of New Lidice live with constant awareness of the history that defines their community's identity, a burden but also a responsibility that shapes how they understand their connection to the place. Visitors to Lidice encounter a landscape that forces confrontation with the capacity of states to inflict total destruction on civilian populations. The empty fields where the original village stood, marked now only by foundations and memorial elements, create a visual absence that communicates loss more powerfully than any monument could. Walking through the rose garden, reading the names of children who were murdered, seeing photographs of families that were annihilated, visitors face the human reality behind historical statistics. The experience is designed to be uncomfortable and challenging, refusing easy consolation or redemptive narratives that would soften the historical truth of what occurred here. The memorial at Lidice makes no attempt to extract positive lessons or to suggest that the massacre produced any beneficial outcome. Unlike some memorials that frame atrocity within narratives of resistance, liberation, or eventual justice, Lidice presents what happened with stark clarity. Innocent people were murdered, a community was destroyed, and nothing that came after could restore what was lost. The murdered men do not return, the children remain dead, and the families stay broken. This refusal of redemptive framing represents an ethical choice to honor victims by acknowledging that their deaths were meaningless from any perspective except the perpetrator's ideology of terror. The number of visitors to Lidice has grown steadily, with tens of thousands coming annually to the memorial site. They arrive from Czech Republic and from around the world, some with family connections to the victims, others with broader interests in World War 2. History or Holocaust education. The visitor center provides historical context, exhibition spaces present artifacts and testimonies, and guided tours lead groups through the memorial landscape. The experience typically requires several hours, as the site is extensive and the historical information detailed. Many visitors report that literacy affects them more deeply than larger memorials to Nazi crimes, perhaps because the scale is comprehensible in a way that the millions of Holocaust victims are not. 500 people lived in Literacy. 173 men and boys were executed. 82 children were murdered. These numbers can be grasped by human imagination in ways that 6 million cannot. The massacre at Literacy stands in the historical record as evidence of the Nazi state's willingness to annihilate entire communities in service of occupation policy and ideological terror. It demonstrates that German forces under Nazi command were capable of murdering children en masse, of systematically destroying villages, and of pursuing these actions with bureaucratic efficiency and official approval at the highest levels. The massacre occurred not as a spontaneous eruption of wartime chaos, but as a planned operation conducted over multiple days with careful attention to eliminating all traces of the village's existence. This calculated quality makes Literacy particularly significant for understanding the nature of Nazi occupation. Violence was not an unfortunate side effect of war but a deliberate tool used to reshape populations through terror. For Czech national memory, Literacy represents both trauma and resilience. The village's destruction was among the most severe atrocities committed on Czech territory during the occupation, and it created wounds that persist across generations. But the decision to rebuild the village, to preserve the site as memorial, and to maintain international connections through the Literacy name also represents refusal to allow Nazi destruction to be final. The new village, the memorial, and the continuing commemoration assert that communities cannot be erased, that memory survives attempts at annihilation, and that the names and stories of victims will be preserved even when perpetrators sought to eliminate all trace of their existence. The site where Literacy stood continues to exist as a wound in the landscape, a place where the ordinary patterns of Czech village life were interrupted by extraordinary brutality and where the memory of that interruption is maintained through conscious effort by those who came after. The roses bloom each summer, the museum preserves the photographs and testimonies, and visitors walk through the empty fields trying to imagine homes and families that existed here before they were destroyed. The wind moves through the grass covering foundations of buildings that were burned and demolished. The stream flows in new channels cut after the Germans diverted it from its original course. And the names of the dead are preserved in stone and bronze and in the testimonies of survivors who spoke their stories before time ended their witness. Literacy enters historical consciousness as both specific event and universal symbol. The particularity of what happened here on June 9th and 10th, 1942 matters. These specific men were executed, these particular children were murdered, this actual village was destroyed. But Literacy also represents all villages annihilated during the war, all communities targeted for collective punishment, all places where civilians experienced the full horror of totalitarian occupation. The name Literacy carries meaning beyond its geographic origin because the pattern of what happened here was repeated across Eastern Europe with variations but similar fundamental brutality. Understanding Literacy requires holding both its specificity and its representative quality simultaneously, honoring the particular victims while recognizing the broader patterns of atrocity that the massacre exemplifies. The memorial continues its work of preservation and education, understanding that each generation must newly encounter this history and decide what responsibilities it bears for maintaining memory of events it did not experience. The challenge intensifies as temporal distance increases and as the number of people with any personal connection to the victims decreases. The memorial addresses this challenge through educational programs, through digital preservation of testimonies and photographs, and through international partnerships that connect Literacy to broader networks of genocide and atrocity memorialization. The work is never finished because memory requires active maintenance, and each new generation must choose whether to engage with difficult history or to allow it to fade into comfortable obscurity. Literacy stands as permanent testimony to what was done in this place and as perpetual challenge to those who encounter its story. The village demands recognition that ordinary people became victims of extraordinary crimes, that children were murdered for being born in the wrong place, and that communities can be targeted for annihilation by states that recognize no limits on their power. The testimony of Literacy is uncomfortable and disturbing, offering no easy lessons or redemptive conclusions. But discomfort is appropriate response to mass atrocity, and the memorial's refusal to soften its historical truth honors the victims by presenting their deaths not as sacrifices that serve some higher purpose but as crimes that destroyed lives and futures that had value solely in themselves. The men who were executed had worth as individuals, the children who were murdered had potential that was stolen from them, and the community that was destroyed had meaning that cannot be replaced by rebuilding or remembrance, only acknowledged as irretrievable loss. This is what liturgy teaches, and this is what the memorial preserves: testimony to absence, witness to loss, and permanent record that these people lived and that their deaths constitute an accounting that history must not forget.